Parenting in the Pew by Mrs. Robbie Castleman. Chapter 3, Praise and Puppies. In the imagination of youngsters, doctors live in hospitals and teachers live at school, and more than a few children in our years of ministry have been surprised to see my husband at places other than the church building. I remember being in the supermarket one day when we came upon a mother and son from our congregation. The kindergartner whispered to his mom in a voice full of wonder, "Mom, Mr. Breck gets his groceries here too." Children identify people with places in rather concrete ways. Sometimes ideas get mixed up with amusing results. My husband looks like Jesus. If there is a play, Breck gets to be Jesus because he is tall, thin, and bearded and has rather shaggy curly hair. Add to this my husband's gentle nature and deep kindness, and one can understand how a child could be confused. One morning, 3-year-old Matthew waited in the pew for Breck to enter the sanctuary, but we were gone on vacation, and the visiting pastor entered instead. He was a godly man, I am sure, but he was short and balding and had no beard. Matthew was disappointed, to say the least. I wish I could have been there to see this toddler stand up on the pew, stomp his foot, and ask loudly, "Well, where's Jesus?" Matthew just expected Jesus to be at church, and the pictures in his Bible and Sunday school papers sure looked a lot like the fellow who talked about God every week. It was a delight to hear this story and to see Breck the very next week take Matthew in his office for a chat. Breck's stock probably dropped some after that, but the Lord was pleased. God delights in children, in their expectancy, in their vulnerability, and ability to believe. These are gifts of grace that children bring to a church family. Parenting in the Pew encourages children to participate in the life of the church, to share these gifts of unfettered faith and expectation. Children can enhance the worship of God for the whole congregation. Children believe. Children are a symbol of the kingdom, indeed the greatest in the kingdom. Matthew records, "At that time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, 'Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?' He called a little child and had him stand among them. And he said, 'I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes a little child like this in my name welcomes me.'" Matthew 18:1-5. We need children in our churches. They can remind us vividly what it means to be great believers. Young children have the capacity to accept as truth what is told to them by adults. Even at fairly early ages, they can learn to tell the difference between the imaginary and the real if this distinction is made by trusted adults. But children delight in believing what adults find difficult to swallow. The ideas of faith we share need careful telling. Jesus used the idea of the unseen wind to illustrate the reality of the Spirit. The adult Nicodemus in John's 3rd chapter needed such an illustration to help him grasp the truth. Children also find stories, illustrations, and word pictures helpful for grasping ideas of faith that cannot be apprehended with the 5 senses. Children are willing to believe, and this means that their hearts have a great capacity for worship. Young children desire to see Jesus, to love him, to be with him. More than a few parents have had to deal with questions about dying after a description of heaven as the place where Jesus lives. I remember our oldest urgently telling my husband to pull over after one such discussion in our car. With its constant heavy traffic, Claiborne Avenue in New Orleans is no street to pull over on. Well, that was 4-year-old Robert's point. We could all hold hands and lay down in the street and go see Jesus together. This same son asked about our obvious grief over the death of a teenager in our youth group. Leukemia had claimed Tim's life about a week before Christmas. When we told Robert of Tim's death, our toddler jumped up and down with joy and envy. We asked if he had understood what we meant. Robert replied with wide-eyed wonder, "Oh, Tim is so happy. He gets to see Jesus blow out the candles on his birthday cake." Yes, and Jesus knew that this delightful faith and fervent love makes for kingdom all-stars. Chronological age is important to consider when paying attention to how children think about God and how they learn to worship. Although individual children are certainly very different, there are general similarities among children that are helpful to bear in mind. Grade school children have a more informed and sober approach to faith than preschoolers like Matthew, but they are seldom less willing to believe. They just want to know more. Older grade school children have learned that parents and teachers can be wrong, but they still don't expect them to be. Yet they will ask questions, lots of questions. Adults need to give careful and truthful answers. Scripture needs to be cited time and again as the resource for many answers. Children tend to believe what they read. Children of this age group need to see that faith is no fairy tale. They may no longer assume that Jesus lives at church, but they need to be confident that he lives in real history. Teenagers aren't as tough as they seem when it comes to worship. In fact, worship can help them deal with a crucial question of faith. How do I myself know that this is all true? Teenagers may borrow their parents' car, but they need to own their own faith. Worship can make all the difference between borrowed faith and owned for myself faith. Teens want to encounter God. They want to hear God speak back to them when they pray. They want to know about the faith of others. Teens also want to do something for God. Worship needs to be a big part of that. Too often, teens are told that mowing the church lawn or tending the church nursery is all they can do for God. Worship is seldom seen as serving God, even though the hour between 11 and noon is called the worship service. From toddlers to teens, kids have a substantial capacity for worship. God knows that children are quite ready to believe the truth. Parents need to ask them to listen to it in worship. We need to help them listen, and we need to listen to them when they respond to what they've heard. Children respond. Participation in every syllable of the service is of major importance in training children to worship. But remember, sometimes an encounter with God won't look like one at first. God can surprise us with his presence, and children often are the leaders in boldly approaching the throne of grace. Jeremy is a dear friend's middle son. One Sunday, Jeremy sat with my two grade school age sons and me. Jeremy was 4, barely. During the responsive reading, Jeremy was standing on the pew. As I had learned to do with toddlers, my arms circled around him as I held the book for him to see, and I pointed to the words as the reading progressed. My arms provided control and support. We were concentrating on every word. Even though he was too young to read, Jeremy followed my finger as it pointed to the black words said by the pastor and the red words recited by the congregation. We were reflecting together on the amazing personal knowledge God has of each one of us from Psalm 139. You know when I sit and when I rise. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. Jeremy listened to the words, watched my finger intently. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. Suddenly, Jeremy cried out in an excited whisper, Aunt Robbie, Aunt Robbie! All the children in that church called me Aunt. Looking into his sparkling dark brown eyes and ecstatic smile, I interrupted my own reading to whisper, Jeremy, what is it? Aunt Robbie, Jeremy whispered back energetically, Jesus knows my dog. At first I was stumped. He repeated his discovery with great joy. I thought about the psalm the congregation had just concluded and remembered Jeremy's dog, a fuzzy mongrel named Precious. That was it. I suddenly saw what Jeremy had heard and understood so well. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. Jeremy had heard the word and made an odd connection, but hadn't missed the point. He was right. The God we were encountering knows our getting up and our lying down. He knows our frame and the length and content of our days, lived and yet to come. This God surely does know about Jeremy's dog, Precious. That 4-year-old was learning to worship. Jeremy responded to God with the excitement and wonder and joy that David's psalm was intended to provoke in all of us. God knows all about us. If you have a dog, God knows its name. God was praised that day by Jeremy's joyous discovery. God was worshipped and adored in that bundle of energy. God was blessed because Jeremy was expected to participate in every part of the liturgy, and because he was helped to do so even as a 4-year-old, and because he was there. Children belong. In their book, Resident Aliens, Life in the Christian Colony, Stanley Hauerwas and William Willimon affirm the wisdom of including children in the worship and work of the kingdom. Nestled almost parenthetically in their chapter on ethical conduct in the Christian community is this observation. In many of our modern sophisticated congregations, children are often viewed as distractions. We tolerate children only to the extent they promise to become adults like us. Adult members sometimes complain that they cannot pay attention to the sermon, they cannot listen to the beautiful music when fidgety children are beside them in the pews. Send them away, many adults say. Create children's church so these distracting children can be removed in order that we adults can pay attention. These professors at Duke University conclude their point by noting, Interestingly, Jesus put a child in the center of his disciples, in the midst of them, in order to help them pay attention. The child was a last-ditch effort by God to help the disciples pay attention to the odd nature of God's kingdom. Few acts of Jesus are more radical, countercultural than his blessing of children. Nashville, Abington, 1989, page 96. Now, it must be acknowledged that some churches have developed children's church for reasons other than sending fidgety children away for an hour. Some churches have a children's church to help prepare children for the adult service, to learn creeds and hymns and the meanings behind rituals. Many churches settle for another version of Sunday school with lessons and activities. Even though I consider the former more useful than the latter, I wouldn't be writing this book if I felt it was best. Churches sometimes develop programs for children because parents are not equipped or willing to train their children in the things of faith. Children can help. Parents are the best people to teach their children what it means to worship God. And I believe that parenting in the pew helps adults as well as their offspring to pay attention. Children have wonderful ways of making a point that every preacher dreams his congregation will get. Children tend to respond immediately to an idea that grabs their attention. Pastors of the quietest congregations know the joy of hearing an audible answer to rhetorical questions that punctuate a sermon. One time, my husband gave a call to missions in the Lord's words from Isaiah 6:8. "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" He paused for effect, and a first grader called out, "I'll go if my mom will let me." More than a few parents have had to comfort their children when the suffering of Good Friday touched tender hearts. I remember the tears of my boys when they understood Jesus' sacrifice for their sin for the first time. They felt so grieved that it had to be that way. Children remind those of us more familiar with the truths of Scripture how we should respond. They remind us all what it means to marvel at God's grace like those who first received it. Children help us to pay attention to what God is really saying. The first grade missionary and Jeremy both displayed the deep capacity of children to respond to God, to worship in spirit and in truth. They responded to the truth of God with awestruck insight, with worship. God was in church on those Sundays, reminding all of us that he knows everything about us, asking us to go and love the world for his sake. Jeremy and that first grade missionary, whose name I cannot remember, responded with eager joy. And I'm sure that Jeremy could reassure what's-his-name that God knows everything and would never forget his name.